Welcome back to the Citizens Defending Freedom Show. Coming up today, we will hear an update from CDF's National Research and Policy Analyst on the U.S. Census American Communities Survey. But first, before we get started, head to our website, citizensdefendingfreedom.com, and hit the subscribe button to make sure you don't miss out on any of our content. Last month, it was announced that the U.S. Census plans to go forward with implementing the addition of sexual orientation and gender identity as categories on the U.S. Census American Communities Survey, otherwise known as the ACS, the nation's premier source for information about America's changing population, housing, and workforce. This survey is sent to approximately 3.5 million households per year. The survey determines where $675 billion of federal funding is allocated and applies to anyone over the age of 15. These changes were originally proposed back in September of 2023 following an executive order from President Biden the year prior instructing the development of practices for collecting sexual orientation and gender identity data in federal statistics. This now includes the U.S. Census. Joining us today to discuss these proposed changes to the ACS in further detail is Stephanie Bontell, National Research and Policy Analyst for Citizens Defending Freedom. Stephanie, thank you for being here. Can you please provide us with more details about the ACS and the role it plays in national policy and for stakeholders?
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, the ACS is delivered to approximately 3.5 million households per year. Unlike the U.S. Census, which is taken every 10 years, the ACS is taken annually, and folks receive it in the form of a paper questionnaire online or via a U.S. Census Bureau representative during a personal visit to their home. The survey is random, so there's no telling who's going to ultimately receive the ACS. But as mentioned, the ACS does determine where approximately $675 billion of federal funding is distributed each year. So, for example, the U.S. Department of Justice, Department of Labor, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, for example, all these various agencies use the ACS to estimate how to ultimately best meet the needs of their agencies and how to best distribute aid. So, for example, the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs uses the ACS to determine or evaluate the needs for healthcare, education, and employment programs for veterans. The U.S. Department of Education uses the ACS to develop adult education literacy programs. So the ACS serves a variety of needs. This data is ultimately leveraged to best address those needs. At the local level, policymakers use this data to help gauge or evaluate the needs ranging from infrastructure of their town or community to ultimately deciding if increasing funding for certain initiatives that may be focused on things like equity and accessibility, diversity, equity, inclusion, for example. So again, there are a variety of different purposes that the ACS may fulfill. Beyond this, it is also cited by a variety of different companies and nonprofit organizations as a source of market research to ultimately determine the legitimacy of certain funding mechanisms or structures, that is deciding where certain forms of grants or donations are ultimately channeled for community purposes or projects.
How will the addition of these new categories on sexual orientation and gender identity impact the administration of the ACS going forward?
Yeah, so prior to the ACS, the U.S. Census issued something called the Household Pulse Survey upon the 2020 pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, and it was the first time a U.S. Census Bureau sponsored survey included questions about sexual orientation and gender identity. So that was really the precedent to the ACS adding these additional categories. However, unlike the ACS, this survey was only sent to approximately 60,000 households, which is different, obviously, than the 3.5 million who would receive the ACS. But like the Household Pulse Survey, also distributed again by the U.S. Census, both are going to include questions assuming the gender ideology narrative, promoting ideas like sex assigned at birth, as opposed to asserting the idea that sex is permanent upon birth as an immutable, unchanging characteristic. So essentially, the ACS is now politicizing, like its predecessor in the Household Pulse Survey, identity categories. The proposed changes would include language like assigned at birth, as I already mentioned, allow for one to identify gender along the lines of male, female, transgender, non-binary, or to even utilize a write-in space to ultimately come up with an identity that may not fit those that are already pre-given or predetermined in the census if none of those ultimately adequately describe one's gender identity. The same holds for sexual orientation. There are categories for that as well. But essentially, by adding these categories, in particular with the addition of gender identity, the U.S. Census, as Senators Rubio and J.D. Vance indicated in a letter sent last November, ultimately legitimizes this erroneous idea that gender is malleable and fluid and not something that essentially is determined at birth or biologically.
On May 29th, Citizens Defending Freedom submitted a public comment taking a stance of opposition against these changes. Can you please speak more about this recent activity?
Absolutely. So our public comment laid out a number of different arguments in opposition to these changes. One of the arguments that we make ultimately addresses the influence of social variables upon the assertion of a particular claimed gender identity. For example, social media, peer pressure, the commercialization of identity. And we cite two studies in particular that really go to this point further. There was a landmark 15-year study that was released early this year that revealed that most adolescents under the age of 18 outgrow confusion around gender identity, with roughly the 11% that was analyzed in that study who expressed these sentiments dropping to just 4% by the age of 25. We argue that this compromises the accuracy and legitimacy of the census data that's ultimately collected by the agency and impairs the perception of the U.S. Census as an objective data ultimately collector, right? So another study that we point to showcases that again, these social variables that impact gender can evolve over time and shape the kind of permanence of the identity that's asserted. And so this makes it especially problematic that the ACS is targeting anyone over the age of 15 in consideration of this reality. Some other points that we raise attention toward is the cost of implementation associated with these changes. So the Census Bureau is asking Congress for $10 million to determine how best to promote this idea that sex is assigned at birth, sex is assigned at birth instead of something that you are just born with. And so we are drawing attention towards this idea that there's a distinction between assigned at birth and this idea that something like gender can change and evolve, and that sex is not something that you are just simply born with, but something that you are rather assigned, and that this promulgates a certain politicized narrative. And again, this is following an executive order that was issued in June of 2022, in which the Biden administration instructed the director of the Office of Management and Budget to develop a report recommending best practices for collecting sexual orientation and gender identity data. And so this initiative by the U.S. Census would be in continuation or promotion of that objective. We also trying to kind of increase social awareness towards the fact that because it is distributed to 3.5 million households per year, this further legitimates the scope and the impact of this gender ideology being promoted at such a significant level that it can be used to even potentially justify federal subsidies aimed at increasing, say, gender-affirming care or other specific medical interventions structured around kind of transgender gender ideology or educational programming that further advances that narrative. And then finally, We cite a letter from Senator Rubio and Senator Vance that was released in November of last year, previously mentioned that this really compromises the integrity of the public perception around the U.S. Census as a credible authority, as an objective authority, that rather is just one more instance we see of a U.S. agency essentially choosing to adopt an ideology that frankly is in a disagreement with what the majority of Americans in fact agree with. So this is an issue that really encompasses a larger phenomenon that we're witnessing, and we're hoping folks will use this as a chance to educate themselves about unfortunately what we're witnessing further, and how to best prepare for it in the future.
Thank you, Stephanie. Before we go, we want to leave you with our inspirational Bible verse of the week. This week's verse is Romans 8:6. The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. As you can see, Citizens Defending Freedom is doing important work. Help us today in our fight to protect children, help ensure election integrity, and encourage pastors to get engaged. Please visit citizensdefendingfreedom.com, where you can learn more about our organization and generously contribute to our cause. Have a great day, and make sure to like us on social media and tell your friends about the great things we're doing. God bless.